Revelation 14 outlines the activities occurring because of the birth of the Son of Man. The pattern necessary to fulfill his purpose. The overcoming of the flesh self. The overcoming of the division in mind by which man forgot his maker. The birth of the Son of Man by the new vibrations reaching consciousness from body activities. The earth's forces sing a new song. A new consciousness coming into being and heralds the falling of the self. This new awareness begins the process of cutting all ties to the flesh, reaping the growths of the earth developed in the sun and realizing the power of becoming one with the creative forces in the flesh, cleansing the soul and flesh memories, allowing the merging of the conscious and unconscious minds. And finally, a new consciousness comes into being.
And I looked, and lo, a Lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads.
John is seeing his own memories and his becoming a son of man. He is seeing symbolically the understanding and happenings of the real Son as he became the Son of Man. A lamb on the Mount Zion is symbolic of the attainments reached in the soul by having learned to follow the higher spiritual calling in the creative forces. This climbing in consciousness results from following the law, the word, in faith and allowing the Father's will to be done in and through him who became the Christ by such actions. It is done through the meekness which inherits the earth. Meekness is the manifested language of the Word of God. Mount Zion is a biblically historical mountain and is now a high place, at least from a religious standpoint. In the body it is associated with the operation of mind through the endocrine system. The Son of Man developed to the point of being in contact with the angels of the soul body, the higher natures of the soul. There are 6 angels mentioned directly, and a 7th implied. These angels represent higher dimensions of consciousness more relative to the soul than those associated with the planetary planes and the activities of the churches. The mount represents the highest point of attainment within the body during earth life. This high point of attainment was reached by the Son in his development when he became fully aware, consciously, of what he had to do to fulfill his destiny. His awareness included his previously gained understanding of the forces and their use by which he could judge his evolution, and these were memories brought to mind by the creative forces rather than from outside stimulus. He visualized these sources as body cells of memory in the physical and mental body, which had become purified by his acceptance of his responsibility for them. This is the same 144,000 which we considered in Revelation 7:4. However, in Revelation 7:4, we were studying them from the standpoint of body memory. Here Revelation 14:1 we are looking more at the unconscious and/or soul mind. This difference in perception should be noted, for it points to the need to pay attention to the cause of happenings of all kinds, rather than just to what is happening. In Revelation 7 we looked at memory rather than the causes. Here we begin a deeper search into the self. In order that we can knowingly get the real message behind the facts of all things. Remember that the things of this world are but shadows of the real. Notice this. And with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. Just who were those with him? They could have been lambs or sheep, for he was the shepherd. Or may be better understood in reference to the spiritualized memory cells of the body. In the latter portion of the revelation, we will be focusing on the more universal forces, rather than just the bodies. These cells had his Father's name written in their foreheads, showing that they, being spiritualized, knew nothing except themselves as servants of the creative forces, and hence would only respond to their guidance, for Jesus said that his body only reacted to the Father which lived in him. They could only respond to the Spirit bearing witness with Spirit in the happening. The alignment of the inner spirit with that causing the happenings, as to original purposes brings into play the coherent understanding needed. Further, these spiritualized cells are response areas for memories throughout the body of activities, and thus are also throughout the flesh and spiritual, or soul, bodies. Not just in the brain. Thus this particular number of cells is so pictured as having his father's name written in their foreheads. One may see why the title for Revelation 14 is the subconscious mind, for the influences of the angels and the Lamb are of a universal nature, hence work outside time and space, and cannot be recognized as forces by the conscious mind. The conscious mind works within the limited context of time and space.
And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters and as the voice of a great thunder, and I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps.
This voice from heaven is the only message from consciousness to the body in which the pure tone of original purposes in material actions are allowed to be expressed. Such tones are as the voice of many spiritual actions, many waters, but also would be as the voice of a great thunder. It is as the voice directing Jesus, he did nothing of himself, allowing the Father to work through him. Since the voice is in harmony with first causes and purposes built into the spiritualized cells, they must be the perfect attunement. The voice of harpers harping with their harps are the universal vibrations at work. In Revelation 14 the harpers as mentioned symbolize the souls or spiritual beings that took part in the early attempts to stop the fall of man, but who have not entered the earth plane. These have entered the earth plane, but were those that in the beginning were as the sons of God in the earth plane, and hence are referred to as the first of those redeemed. According to this quote, the original purposes and service of the sons of God in the earth plane are still active in us all. The voice of great authority in the thunder is the voice of conscience which harps at us. For a possible better understanding of these harpers we might borrow a concept from 281:46 which refers to the silver cord connection between the Leiden and the pineal which could act as a single-stringed harp. The vibrations from this harp would, to the mind, be that of a new song. A new tone to the whole body. It would only vibrate to the unadulterated creative influences in the light of original purposes.
And they sung as it were a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth.
The arrival of new vibrations before consciousness from the lower regions of memory may be considered as a new step in the evolving consciousness of the Son of Man. All of us must eventually attune our reactions to the creative forces within us, rather than to our desires. The new song before the throne is a new experience coming to the individual. It is not like our habit patterns asking for a repeat performance before the four beasts and the elders as we found in Revelation 4, wherein the beasts and elders play their part in the creation of memories. It is as if the beasts and elders are the audience and must also learn new ways from observing the model player. The new pattern of purified responses, tones, set in the sun. The meaning of this new song is given in the readings in this. What is the meaning of the new song of the harpers? The new experience that comes to each soul. Let's keep it individual, see? The new experience that comes to each soul as to the assurance of that help when necessary of the saints of the Father. In light of this new experience, we can see that there is a changed vibration arising to awareness from the flesh portions of memory. By stilling the body reactions, meditation, rather than reacting, the pure creative elements and the life forces flowing through the body have a different tone than when adulterated by our own desires and purposes. We have seen in Revelation 8 how these forces are disturbed and adulterated by the self. The earth elements form our desires into images which become patterns for response, as platforms for our temperaments. These are built into the body cells as memories. Our very own created selves which tie us to the flesh in which we lodge our self-identity. Hence we identify with the flesh. When we stand still, meditation, the memories of first causes in the soul which never forgets, are brought to awareness by the new song spoken of here. For they are vibrations from the soul itself which harps back to the original purposes before it became entangled with the flesh. This begins the separation of the soul identity and flesh identity formed in Revelation 13. So it is that these memories are first redeemed from the earth, for they, the ideals and purposes which existed before coming into the earth, begin to correct their error of merging with the flesh mind. Here the prodigal son remembers his father, but the return to him is the continuing revelation. For this return, help comes from the most unexpected quarters. Memories of help, the spirit of, built into the cells of early man, before the fall, by the soul, that in the beginning, was as the Son of God. They are as the saints of the Father. These vibrations would surely make for a new song to most of us. And we must keep it individual, for we each have our very own paths to follow. Yet all within the context of one way. This new song would not be a new one, except that, by reason of the diversion of the soul into flesh, it would not have learned the full range of its creative efforts, for flesh is the testing portion of the universal vibration. This testing had to be done by the earth forces, and we had to be them before we could know the results of their testing abilities. Thus the fall was necessary for those souls who would know themselves to be one with God. The spirit of rebellion, Satan, was and is a helpmeet to man, not only because of God's directive regarding the testing of Job, but also because the testing of the universal forces had to be accomplished by the totality of the universal directives themselves operative in the earth plane, so that this testing process could be known by the sons of God. Satan, or the rebellious spirit, had to play his part in the play of opposites, the game of good against evil. To the extremes of both the separations as well as the combinations of forces, so that the earth plane would fulfill its mission as being the testing portion of the full range of vibrations. By this mission she births the Son of Man. It was necessary that both positive and negative forces become exemplified to the participants in the testing, thus the combining of the soul forces through mind with the earth forces through flesh. Both could oppose or work with the other by the use of the will. The Son, exemplified in Jesus, came to know and be one with the creative earth forces by directing them to fulfill their original purposes. He became their master, and the wind, the water, the stones, the fire and the very life forces came to obey him in the manifested Son. Jesus. They served him because he had served them. The new song was also heard by the four beasts, which together with the elders were before the throne, and this is the recognition of their master spoken of above. The elders too had their part in the play as symbols of acceptances or rejections, molded by the will, in the thought forms created by the elements. Remember that the four beasts are symbolized figures, images of the four earthly natures in man, namely, propagation, sustenance, preservation and gratification, as portrayed in Revelation 4. The new song, vibrations, affects all body forces. The body-mind, the consciousness, also helps to recall in them their beginnings, their purposes. No man, no conscious mind, without having done as the Son, can comprehend this new song, for it is outside his experiences and memories. Man, us, never heard it before, and thus has no memory of it by which to recognize it. However, in the Son the spiritualized selves, the 144,000, have this memory, hence they understand. At this point they all have one mind. These reactions have been redeemed from self-reactions. They have been spiritualized. By making our will one with the will of God. They are loosed from underneath the throne. Redeemed from their jail where we put them by the earthly desires in us, and are redeemed from the earth. In the Son.
These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb.
Here we take stock of the development in the Son as well as in ourselves, as we may remember and do the first works. These are the imprints of the first causes in man, being from the Father and in the soul as memories, for we must remember that there was not a total integration of soul and body in man, as symbolized by the split mind, conscious-unconscious, Revelation 13. Hence some purposes, memories, could not be merged into the flesh body or mind of the ego. Deep in us is a reverence and knowledge of something greater than I, which cannot otherwise be expressed. These I's are those memories which are not defiled with the separations between soul and mind. They do not know the separated fleshly desires, and hence are not defiled with women. The key to understanding this is the word with. It does not say by women. The conceptualizations in the soul mind are wholeness of concepts and are not defiled with the separation aspect so dominant in the brain's, ego's, understanding. Hence we find the basis, in ourselves, for memories not being defiled with women. Woman, per se, is the manifested principle of acceptance which is the basis for knowing patience. The acceptance of responsibility for whatever we do. And this consciousness separation was necessary in us, because it also manifests the separation of a part of us from the soul, to form the flesh man part of us. The ego, Revelation 13. This also is reflected in the story of the rib being taken from Adam, soul mind subconscious, during his deep sleep, and Eve, conscious ego, was given a nature of acceptance of responsibility, for a helpmeet for, 2, Adam. Remember that God had made man male and female, Genesis 1:27, before he took Adam's rib and made a helpmeet for him, God created a conscious as a helpmeet for the soul mind or subconscious. These virgins, as memories, have not been defiled with the indulgences of the flesh. A conscious, ego, function. Furthermore, they follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth, because they are a part of the soul's remembrances from before even coming into the earth plane, remembered as impulses from the inner self, to do what the I ought would have us do. That these are redeemed from among men is shown by the woman fleeing into the wilderness, to a place prepared of God. In this we found that the soul is separated from the body and is nourished in other realms of consciousness between earth incarnations. It is thus that there are the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb, for Jesus said, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." The everlasting watch over us seems adequate to fulfill the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb, for the rest of the revelation shows the mercies of God to all who would follow the Lamb. Regardless of how man holds to his desires, eventually fulfilling his love for man.
And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God.
Here again we find those forces in man from the beginning, in the soul memories and soul forces, which held fast to their original purposes. Never having taken part in the fall, they are without fault among the other forces in man. This, of course, can be likened to souls, as sons of God, who entered the earth plane, but chose not to enter the earth's forces. Such souls are spoken of in the readings given on the creation of man. See Eula Allen's Creation Trilogy. Before the Beginning. The River of Time. And You Are Forever.
And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation, and kindred, and tongue, and people.
The new song in Revelation 14:3 revealed a new state of consciousness to the Son of Man. This understanding brought another force or activity into awareness, just as did the awareness of the soul mind merged with the flesh mind in Revelation 13. John sees the good flying about because of the development going on in the Son. The new song. Since this is a new song, for others, and came about by reason of the cooperation of the earth forces with the universal forces, the resulting influence was seen as an angel in the midst of heaven, consciousness. By this new awareness the Son took a giant step of an everlasting nature, for it was written into John 13:16, it was the herald of the everlasting life promised there. Since this was the first of the angels given in this chapter, a question about them was answered in the readings. Please explain the symbols of the angels, mentioned in Revelation 14. What is meant by the symbols of the sickles and reaping? That those individuals who have and are a part of the active force in a material world are to work, to give forth, to give out of their strength, their selves in active service, and not as those that would rest, from the material angle, but as the reapers, as the harvesters. Which to the individual mind means labors for a definite purpose and service. This angel with the everlasting gospel to preach means the everlasting quality, or influence of the new song. It was to be preached to them that dwell on earth. It simply means those who dare to try to follow in the way set by Jesus. But this also applies in us, for it refers to the cells of memory, thoughts and kindred responses throughout all relationship within and without us, all of which we associate with the nations, kindreds and tongues. The people means us, as people.
Saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. And worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters."
We should keep in mind reading 281:36 above as we move through the rest of this chapter, for we are seeing the angelic directive to the body, and our application of the universal forces coming into play in us by reason of our seeking, to become the sons of man, as did Jesus. The first three angels appear to bring us messages regarding the creative efforts in us as we build the controlling features in our lives, our temperaments. The loud voice may mean the happenstances in our lives that try to get our attention. The forces that bring them to pass are the manifest words of God and bring fear of God into our lives, for they, the happenings, seem to be beyond our understanding. Yet we must give credit to a greater mind, a universal force, than ours, and thus give glory, the ability to serve, to whatever force brings them into our lives. These happenings are from the universal consciousness, while our consciousness is primarily conditioned by our own use of the creative earth influences adulterated by our desires. Such a realization, by us or by the Son, would make us see the awesome power of the judgments behind this unknown but universal force. It should cause us, not only to fear God, but to honor and give our creative service, glory, to such power that could create the heavens, the earth, the life forces, the sea, and the sources, the fountains of water, from which the happenstances must come to us. We must become used to these universal forces working in us, rather than equating them with our own familiar body forces. In this we meet the first of our reactions to the beginning of the spiritualization of our body-mind cells of memory for responses. Heretofore we have used only the earthly forces in our creative efforts associated with the lower glandular natures. Again we can see that we should not bow down to the images we create, but rather should worship the creator of the forces, which created our consciousness of the forces we have been using. Thus there needs to be a new awareness as the basis for our developing consciousness. Each of the three angels shown in this and the following verses are considered to be aspects of, or from, the universal consciousness.
And there followed another angel saying, "Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication."
Babylon refers to the self whose identity stands in our created images. Our temperaments. This concept, as well as our activities of creating it, must fall away from our new awareness. The older awareness must be replaced by a new one not made by us, hence the reason for the fear in the previous verse. It is like the fear of suddenly being someone else, and we fear who would do such to us. We properly fear God. The repeated phrase, "is fallen," is also like the thunderous voice, harping at us from on high. We must pay attention, for no longer are we the comfortable self we created, which is made up of the many facets of ourselves, each with its own form and life, such as to call ourselves not one, but many selves. In fact, we have become a whole city of selves, each one, as a person, doing its own thing. Thus the self is a city of identities made up of our indulgent forms of reactions. Small wonder that the self is called a city of Babylon. In becoming a son of man, this self must give way to a greater awareness as we become horror of horrors. Someone else. This city of selves, considered great by our ego, remember we would never change places with someone else and be them, has forced the body's many response areas, the nations, to accept the spirit, the wine, in which we accepted our created concepts. We have become drunk on the headiness of our own fermenting selves, as we savor the delicacies of the exotic and forbidden fruits of earthly temptations. This is the wine of the wrath we feed the body, forcing it to drink our headiness. Thus it might well be said that we are a manifested fornication. Not fornicators. As a principle of life, and not just as an idea.
And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand.
The third angel, also representing the universal consciousness. Again with a loud voice, that necessary thunder, that makes people afraid to not pay attention. Brings a specific indulgence to mind, which relates to the very core of ourselves. The subject is the worship of the beast, the ego, and his image. Revelation 13, review the comments there for a full understanding of this verse. We certainly can see the relevancy of this verse to that whole chapter, as well as the results portended, because of what is shown in the next two verses. All of which describe the effects of our worship of the ego and his image as we experience a new awareness or refuse to accept the new understanding and hold tenaciously to the self we have created. All the activities presented in these verses show us what we should do to turn the self's activities to that attitude of for others in active service, to give of our new strength in all our efforts, because of our changed attitudes from that of self toward that of a definite purpose and service.
The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb.
For those who worship the ego, the beast, and his image, there must come the results foretold in Revelation 13:10. The law must be fulfilled, what a man sows he must reap. In this respect we are captives to our own acceptance of the self as being the supreme authority over us. The ego and its image mean more to us than the consciousness of the all-directing force from God coming to us through a possible new awareness. We forget or overlook the maker of both ourselves and the forces we use to create the images by which we keep self from being responsible for its actions. So our actions must drink of the wine of the wrath of God. The wine, in this case, is the pure unadulterated spirit found in the law of cause and effect. It is without admixture, that is, unadulterated as is the ego self, which is a result of a mixture of the spirit of indulgence of the soul with the spirit in the flesh. See Revelation 13. In other words, God, or the mind in the creative forces, is indignant at the non-justification of such a mixture of the creative forces in himself, for all forces are in God. God seems to be a God of anger, and the anger is poured out into the cup of his indignation. Those who hold to their own concept shall be tormented with fire and brimstone, meaning, again, they shall suffer the justice of the law. Fire and brimstone are justice manifested, which transforms the earthly forces into their original components, or back to their original purposes. These transforming efforts occur in the presence of the holy angels, which are those angels of the churches found in Revelation 2 and 3. They seem to be the forces which would lead us correctly as they work toward bringing us their light of understanding. And these are the forces we call colors in light. This would also apply to the Lamb, the Christ, who would save all by overcoming the self. As to how we might have to meet this fire and brimstone, the readings say this. Will we be punished by fire and brimstone? That is builded by self. As those emblematical influences are shown through the experiences of the beloved in that builded, that created. For, each soul is a portion of creation, and builds that in a portion of its experience that it, through its physical mental or spiritual mental, has builded for itself. And each entity's heaven or hell must, through some experience, be that which it has builded for itself. Is thy hell one that is filled with fire or brimstone? But no, each and every soul is tried so as by fire, purified, purged, for he, though he were the Son, learned obedience through the things which he suffered. Ye also are known even as ye do, and have done.
And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up for ever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name.
The smoke refers to the vibrations which arise to consciousness from the lower portion of our bodies, where the earthly forces of fire, karma, debts, if one accepts it, are met in a justification effort of our own created images. This smoke arises in self from our created images, for we created the idea of worshipping both the beast, the ego, and its image. And we suffer the consequences. The consequences of our worshipping calls for us to meet self. We have erred in giving credit to the beast and his image for his efforts in our making. But we created what we identify with, hence we must take the responsibility for what we create. Our trying to shift responsibility to others and to Satan, the spirit of rebellion, causes us to suffer so much. We have created for ourselves a hell. Yet if heaven is a state of consciousness, so is hell, and its vibrations, smoke, rise to awareness until our hell is changed, until the consciousness of such a condition in us changes. Here we run up against the smoke rising forever and ever, and this requires a concept of never-ending time. Time, however, is only a measure of our understanding of an idea, and when our understanding of the idea of hell changes, then also our consciousness of it necessarily changes. We then can no longer be in hell. We might see the real need for the sense of time. The sense of the ramifications of our experiences resulting from latching on to an idea until it no longer serves our awareness of that separated idea. This then leads us eventually to realize our separation from God or the creative forces with which we work. As an illustration of how the idea of time as a measure of our understanding holds us in time, we might consider again Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Each denied responsibility for eating the forbidden fruit. Adam blamed Eve and she in turn blamed Satan. The focus here is on blaming another for what we do. In this present day and age we sometimes do the same thing. Our actions are a repetition of that original act of focusing the blame on another. Hence we are caught in the time, the understanding, that existed then. For us, however, in the here and now situation, it would be well to carefully study the chapter in A Search for God on Day and Night. There we will find the answer to the meaning of the phrase day nor night mentioned in this verse. Simply put, it means facing toward the light of consciousness or facing away from the source of our being. The darkness of not understanding. It also is shown in the acceptance, day, or rejection, night, of our responsibility for us or for others. The last portion of this verse refers to the activities shown in Revelation 13. Yet through this shown here, as well as the rest of this representation, we should keep in mind that the thing being shown John are those experiences of the Son of Man in his becoming the Christ, and they are a part of us and our daily living experiences. The Son was showing John in symbols what could not be put into words. Happenings in consciousness can only, still, be experiences.
Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus.
The patience of the saints in us is pointing to the possibility that we might not have to endure the full effects or reap what we have grown to be, as posed in the latter verses, if we will only take responsibility for what we create in us. We should remember it is in patience that we may possess our souls. Patience is a measure of our understanding of the purpose of whatever happens, and this measuring is not ours to make. It is done without the city of self. See verse 20. Taking responsibility for our creations as a way to react, brings us through the torments of suffering portrayed in the preceding verses, simply because we gain the understanding necessary to meet whatever happens, in the Christ way. Plain acceptance of responsibility, before meeting the happenings. This is what Jesus did, and it was a necessary factor in his becoming a Son of Man. In doing this, we bypass, so to speak, the second sin of not taking responsibility by Adam and Eve. It may well be analogous to the first commandment given by Jesus regarding whom we should worship, and the new commandment given in John 13:34. Love one another, as I have loved you. We have to ask ourselves this. If Adam and Eve had not blamed Satan, would this so-called second sin still have us caught in time back there? And, would there have been a need for the new commandment given by Jesus? These questions may well be rhetorical, but their relevance to the possibility of not meeting self in self, as posed in verse 20 below, seems to bear upon the patience of the saints. In this verse, thus they that keep the commandments of God, as in the Garden of Eden, are those who love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. In this commandment is there room for possible leniency according to the understanding of the mind? We would have to answer yes to this. As presented. However, in the case where we know of the second sin, and do it, would the new commandment given by Jesus fulfill the requisite prescribed in the faith of Jesus? While here again the question may well be rhetorical, somewhere there must be a reason for the faith of Jesus being included in the verse. Also a reason for outside the in verse 20 below. We tie the two together so, as to have possibly a better understanding. Others may gain a different meaning, but this is what the revelation study is all about, an individual's own revelation.
And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them.
The voice from heaven is the voice of the soul mind that now, for the Son of Man, has become as the voice of the intelligence behind the soul. Yet it is from the consciousness in the Christ as the Son. John was told to write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. This seems to be an addition to the list of the blessed in Matthew 5. It is a new one which came into being because Jesus had become the Christ, the Savior of all, by reason of his death and crucifixion. For the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth seems best interpreted in the light of this reading. Where are the dead until Christ comes? Do they go direct to him when they die? As visioned by John the Beloved, there are those of the saints making intercession always before the throne for those that are passing in and out of the interbetween, even as he, the Christ, is ever in the consciousness of those that are redeemed in him. The passing in, the passing out, is as but the summer, the fall, the spring, the birth into the interim, the birth into the material. What is meant by blessed are the dead which are in the Lord from henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. The changes that have come and the assurance that has come to each individual who has recognized that the Lamb, or the Christ, or the activities of Jesus becoming the Christ, are the assurance of the activity of the Christ in the passage from the material plane to the celestial. For as he preached to those bound even in the shadows of death, loosened that which made it possible for them to become again conscious of the opportunities for reconstructing of themselves in the experiences through which error had come, so blessed then are they who die in the Lord. For the body alone is bound. As long as we are bound by rigid concepts of where we go and what we do after the death of the body, we are as dead to a growth in consciousness. Since it is through the body that we fix ideas and concepts, there is the necessity for a return to first causes to release them from our awareness. In similar fashion we must tend our indulgences, for they reflect spirit used in error. For self. That becomes distorted in the soul as we apply it in earth experiences. The spirit, too, must eventually return to its maker, just as we must return to our maker. Just as the activities of Jesus, in becoming the Christ. Set the model of the way, so we too, if we follow in his footsteps, may become one with his activities, and thus be cleansed by him. Saving self from self. These ideas seem to help us further understand the latter portion of this verse, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, which points to the need for the returning again and again to first causes for cleansing. The last part, and their works do follow them, bears directly on the idea above that, what we do in spirit becomes the essence of the soul, for all of us would present a purified self to our Maker.
And I looked, and behold a white cloud. And upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle.
This white cloud seems to be the white, or purified, spirit in the Son of Man upon which he took the stands he did in life. For the unadulterated life force provided the basis for all his earth reactions. As this image, he looked like the Son of Man. The earth had done its job in giving birth to a son which became totally purified, for the earth's creative forces, in the body, had taken their direction from the essences of the pure energy and the life activities of Jesus in becoming the Christ. Thus the image looked like that son, and that image was shown to John as the purified actions in consciousness. This image, though, was not yet the Christ. But it did reflect the image of the Son of Man. From this point on, in the life of the entity, the Son, by his activities in the earth as Jesus, worked to become the Christ. The going back to first causes, first principles, is reflected in the golden crown on the Son's head. He had the head of first principles as the directing influence in his being. The sharp sickle in his hand is the ability to reap what he had sown, not just to experience it, for, as we shall see a little later, the wine press was outside the self, outside the city. The self. As shown by the first cause in spirit and earth's influences. The sharp sickle is associated with the ability in the Christ to forgive, which of course comes from the two-edged sword. This is taken to be the ability to cut the ties to self and, as the Christ, for others. Two edges. We see this clarified in verses 19 and 20.
And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle, and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe.
The work of the Son of Man, the reaping of what he had sown, begins here. These activities shown to John are as pictures of what Jesus had learned. The influence of becoming the Son, as an angel, cried out for expression, just as our own created images, ideas, etc., ask us to become them. The difference, though, is that here was an image created by the unadulterated energies in light. A son of light. Yet one who used the earth forces by allowing them to build images of their creator's desires. In us the same earth forces are adulterated by our desires, yet they also create an image which reflects its first cause. Our desires. Thus they make us in the image imposed upon them. And the earth's elements are bound by that creative effort to us. In the Son, was a harmony of first causes, in both creative energy and the earth elements. The result was a pure white image, that the Son was and sat upon. The cloud is the white of light, of understanding. Again, the earth elements earth, water, fire and air, became the servants of the Son. They obeyed him, for he released them from their bondage. It is easy to see why the earth rejoiced at the birth and wept at the death of its son. The angel, the influence in consciousness, came out of the temple, the body of the image, and, knowing the self to be what it was, cried out for expression. To fulfill the purpose behind its creation again, just as in us, saying with a loud voice the voice of creation itself or the voice of consciousness. Of being, for it knew nothing except it was the pure creative force. Thrust in thy sickle and reap. While this image was the image of the Son of Man in consciousness, it was yet in the flesh man also, and this too needed cleansing, for each and every soul is tried so as by fire. Purified, purged. For he, though he were the Son, learned obedience through the things which he suffered. This influence, the angel's voice, sounded the clarion call of the newly awakened consciousness in the new being to, so to speak, get on with the work. Don't just sit there. And because he knew nothing except that he had to be told what to do. Just like us. This new consciousness was also told the time is come for thee to reap. The understanding, time, as a measure thereof, was there of its purposes. As from the beginning, it too was recalled from within, again because of the influence in it. The time element also brought the urge, or command to do what was necessary, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. He had to reap the fruits of suffering, for they, his experiences, his memories of his trials and sacrifices, had helped in his becoming the Son. Now their job was done and their experience, as memories in the flesh, could be removed. The harvest was ripe. Since the flesh body was no longer needed to express the flesh creations of self's desires, the harvest was needed to bolster the earth's efforts through the unbounded earth elements.
And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped.
By reaping the earth, the Son of Man cleansed his flesh body of all impulses and memories, which could possibly give impetus to his body of fleshly desires. This prepared the flesh body also to be one with those same creative forces which produced the Son. Hence Jesus could later say, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he seeth the Father do. For what things soever he doeth, these also doeth the Son likewise."
And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle.
Since there is no indication here as to the nature or function of this angel, one might well wonder about it, except that in verse 19, this angel was given direction by the next angel to come forth in verse 18. These angels might be the subject of much speculation as to which one does what and so on, but for now, we'll just keep them in our wonder basket until we need to know.
And another angel came out from the altar which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe.
For this angel there are two possible identifying marks in the first statement. The first is that it came out from the altar. This seems to be an allusion to the sacrificial altar in self wherein the self is offered up for others, for by their self-sacrifice, memories of all actions would be cleansed from the soul. We have looked at the cleansing of the flesh memories in verse 16. An influence not associated with the earth elements or memories was needed for the soul cleansing. One from another dimension of consciousness in the earth's plane, yet one which had power over fire. Well, fire is one of the earth's elements. And is the manifested principle of justice. This angel appears to be one associated with the universal fire, and so does not have the same activities as the earth's fire. This one could well be more the principle of justice about which we have speculated. Tempered by earth forces, it is still the same essential force. The gathering of the clusters of the vine of the earth could relate to the vine associated with Jesus. It could well be that this is the gathering of all influences faced by the man in his becoming the Son, for he learned obedience through the things he suffered. The fact of the statement that these grapes also were ripe should indicate them to be similar to those reaped by the Son in verse 16. We should not, however, overlook the statement in 281:36, which refers to Christ as having preached to those bound even in the shadows of death. We should keep our minds open until we experience the same process shown here.
And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God.
Here again is a reference to justice found in the wrath of God. Notice that the angel's sickle was thrust into the earth, which should indicate all the earth's planes, and not just the earth on which man lives. This too should be considered under the preceding verse. It is interesting that this gathered vine was cast into the great wine press of God, which is not just an on-earth place or activity. Just where what it is seems most relevant. Since the idea is first mentioned in this verse, it should be explained here, although its activity also is a major part of the next verse. As some may notice, the idea is not new. Just the terminology. The idea is embodied in letting be whatever happens in any circumstance. While Jesus lived through and experienced it in his life, it was later given its greatest impetus by Meister Eckhart and in this century by Martin Heidegger. The most striking examples of letting it be can be found in those things that seem to just happen to us. The unexpected happenstances, the reasons for which we seemingly can only blame on the wrath of God. It applies to all happenings. It is further explained in this: the great wine press is the spirit, wine, of the justice of God pressing the truth, the law, of what we ought to do and have not done. The press of the spirit of justice in and behind the things which happen forces us to experience what we have done. This is the law of what we sow we reap. It is the law of love, pressing us toward acceptance of responsibility for whatever happenstances we meet. Our acceptance of them, in thankfulness for the lesson, and without fighting back, allows the forces in the circumstance to take the reins of the horses, in the next verse, and causes them to open ourselves to the mystic of love in the letting be. What we have done must be remembered. Miracles happen by acceptance, and we experience the happening as a blessing. By remembering, accepting responsibility for his actions, Jesus was shown how he ought to do. He then did that, for he said, "I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things." All of this, of course, suggests that the consciousness of God himself is action in our lives through those happenings which are beyond our understanding. Small wonder it is that we do not know this outside consciousness which is in and behind every action. Regardless of the fact that we believe God is out there and does not care what we do, except when we sin. This also gives us courage to believe that in the world are the manifested words of God and the activities of the forms are his language.
And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs.
This verse should assure us that such a place is only in consciousness, for it is without the city. Or outside the self, thereby meaning another plane of consciousness. Since blood came out of the winepress, it would seem that this refers to the press of suffering endured by the Son, when his memories of earth ties to the flesh were cleansed. The fact that the blood came even unto the horses' bridles, however, seems to place it in reference to the horses in Revelation 6. And these horses were part of the functions of light and development of consciousness as help from outside the self. Their placement here would have a part in the developing consciousness in the Son. Earth plane forces are not just in man. The fact that the earth forces can directly affect man from outside him and using the intelligence and the forces themselves indicates more than one plane of consciousness operating in this plane. So we may see that all planes of consciousness are operating in this plane, whether we are aware of them or not. This should help us to see why the earth plane is the testing portion of the universal vibration, and that we are a direct part of that process. And we think we don't amount to much. The blood coming out of the wine press is the removing from memories the life force the Son of Man gave them as living patterns for response. Those memories, habits, which had become him and would not change. This is also applicable in our lives. Only by remembering and taking responsibility for the happenstances, and thus for us, can grace enter and play its miraculous part by taking the reins of the driving forces in our lives. This happens only when we stand still, let go and let God, as in meditation. Then we open ourselves to the mystery of letting be, the mystic of life. Here is an interesting part by the space of or 1,600 furlongs. If this is somehow mystical, then there is a place, and it cannot be conceived of except, as to that term, yet it is without self. The 1 and the 6 added make 7, or the mystical 7 influence and light. The 1 by itself means the beginning, or source, of creation. The 6 is, of course, the first perfect number, hence the 1 and 6 with the zeros added describes the cycles of varying activities in the Son's whole life as he journeyed through the earth's plains on the way to becoming the Son of Man. The word space also needs to be noted as used in reference to the mystical 1600 furlongs. The furlong is an earth distance measurement, while space is a direct connection to a measure of understanding of relationships. This then could have a direct connection to the measure of understanding of the relationships between the developed Son of Man and the earth's portion in that development. Since light and earth forces working through the flesh produce the sun, then the blood even to the horse bridles, or reins, becomes meaningful, for it shows that the process of development of the sun and earth was a mystical or outside the earth plane activity, yet in the earth. This should help clarify the concept that Jesus was in the earth but not of the earth as a development, but was of the universal forces, thus outside the city. The self has nothing directly to do with the development going on in us. Our evolving is a universal phenomenon. The latter verses in this chapter showing the reaping of the earth exemplify the development of the new consciousness in the Son of Man. A merger of the conscious and unconscious minds into one which could see the Father, the original actions and purposes of all forces, so as to be totally one with such forces. Thus he and the Father were one in the earth as Jesus. All of the activities pictured in this chapter have much to do with the life forces given our concepts, and thus the life blood given rises to the bridles, the reins, of the forces, creating our identity, as well as that in the Son of Man. It should be noticed that Revelation 14 deals primarily with the earth forces, in and outside man, while Revelation 15 deals with the forces in man from other planes of consciousness, the planetary planes experienced directly between earth lives. They have a part in us, just as do the earth forces. In the Christ is found the advocate with the Father, and the Spirit of the Father glorified in him that approaches through that manner Christ as advocate. He overcame death in the material, and able to put on immortality in a material world, bringing to man flesh endowed with the ability to be one with the Father, and magnifying the Father in the individual yet in the material plane. Hence each in their respective spheres are but stepping stones to that may awaken in the individual the knowledge of the Son in their lives. When the Prince of Peace came into the earth for the completing of his own development in the earth, he overcame the flesh and temptation. So he became the first of those that overcame death in the body, enabling him to so illuminate, to so revivify that body as to take it up again, even when those fluids of the body had been drained away by the nail holes in his hand and by the spear piercing his side. He came, the Master, in flesh and blood, even as thou didst come in flesh and blood. Yet as he then proclaimed to thee, there is a cleansing of the body, of the flesh, of the blood, in such measures that it may become illumined with power from on high, that is within thine own body to will. Thy will, O God, not mine, but thine, be done in me, through me. For the laws of the Lord are perfect, converting the soul. And as he gained the greater concept of man's position in relation to the world, by entering into the flesh and suffering through same, know he, thy Lord, thy Master knows, and will aid thee in bearing thy material, thy physical burdens. Blessed be his name. Spiritually, these same elements should be given, in the way and manner as has been given, and as have been applied. The entity should understand how that physical condition, even created by spiritual force and action in the material body, so long as in that material body, is subject to all laws of the flesh. This consciousness grows more and more to an awareness in the experience of the entity, for it is a very sensitive entity, often bordering close to the interbetween, in which glimpses are given the entity into a realm not often experienced by other than a soul cleansed in many, many ways. Will I ever be able to diagnose ailments? Will the body consciousness and tender desire that may be a portion of the entity's work? This will be accomplished by a unison of cosmic or universal forces, as here. Edgar Cayce working with universal forces. This may be raised in anyone that so cleanses their own physical consciousness or raises the vibrations of their own physical bodies to that attunement that brings healings to others. Is this entity one who may properly now pursue the higher and inner development of its soul and psychic forces? It is. And in the development of the psychic forces, of the psychic influences and powers in the experience, enter into the Holy of Holies, cleansing the mind, the body, in whatsoever way and manner as prepareth or bespeaketh to thee, that thou mayest present thyself in body and mind as being clean and ready for the acceptance of that the Lord, thy God, may give thee in the way of directions. As he has promised to be thy guide, as he has sent his Son into the earth to show thee the way, be satisfied with nothing less than those that he may guide. Let thy prayer ever be. Thy will, O God, be done in me as thou seest I have need of, that I may be one with thee. Even as that I possessed with thee before the world was. In the evening. Just before the sun in all its glory of the Palestine hills gave forth almost into the voice of nature, proclaiming the heralding of a new hope, a new birth to the earth, and the glorifying of man's hope in God. The specter of his star in the evening sky brought awe and wonder to all that beheld. And the entity, being anxious, gazed with wondering awe at that unusual experience to all, and wept with joy of those unfoldments within self, of the emotions, that made for the expectancy of glory surpassing what had been told of all the glories of her peoples in the days of old. There the entity felt what may be very close akin to the experiences in self in the present. That a new light, a new vision, a new experience was being born in every atom of its being. As the entity walked into the open upon that eve, the brightness of his star came nearer and nearer. And the entity heard, even as the shepherds, peace on earth, goodwill to men. There came again that awe, that feeling of a new creation, of a new experience, as the entity among those. Only with the closer attendant of the mother. Hastened. As it hastened to the quarters where the mother lay, in all that awe of a new experience, and the light, as from his star filled the place, the entity then first beheld the babe. That was the crowning experience, until the plea that she, too, might hold that glorious child in her arms also.